Hello, welcome back to greentv.com. Boy, do we have a great guest for you today.
It's time to say the F words at COP. Look, this is crazily the first time in history, after 30 years of climate negotiations, that we had a robust conversation about phasing out fossil fuels. What I witnessed at those final hours at COP was a distortion of the system and an abuse of power. This new text comes out, no one had seen before, and he takes it into the plenary and gavels it through. Do you know, the island nations, the AOSIS countries, weren't even in the room. We analyze supply chains and data in order to figure out whether or not major corporations and governments are keeping up with their policies and what the bar should be set for different sectors. And now BNP Paribas has actually committed to making the Amazon a no-go area for extractive oil development. And when BNP Paribas did that, our estimation is that they moved $6 to $7 billion of oil finance out of the Amazon because of our research.
Hello, welcome back to greentv.com. Boy, do we have a great guest for you today. I say that all the time, but I get to meet one of my sheroes today, and you probably have heard of her if you follow climate politics, climate policies, activism, especially in Canada. I say after David Suzuki, who was, I think, my all-time favorite guest, and I've interviewed over 1,000. Tzeporah Berman is someone I've been watching for a long, long time when she was younger, and I was younger too. I'm so glad you're still on the front lines, and you really, truly, legitimately are. Tzeporah, for those of you who don't know, is the head of Stand.earth, and she also is the founder, I believe, maybe co-founder of the Fossil Fuel Treaty for Non-Proliferation. You say it.
We just say fossil fuel treaty when we're tired, but it's the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
I say fossil fools too often, so I usually mess that one up just because I'm using my little cute name of something that's not so cute. Welcome back. I know you just back from Dubai, hot off the press. I'm not jet lagged, so I should be able to get my tongue and brain working together. But tell us, I've read about some of your comments and read others, and sounds like it was genuinely a mixed bag. One quote I thought said it well. It said, "We got more than we feared, less than what we needed." What's your impression? Being back home and maybe having a few minutes to reflect.
It was an incredible roller coaster. I said online minutes after the last text came out that it felt to me as though it was both historic and insufficient. And I think that, upon reflection, that really did capture it. Mm-hmm. Look, this is crazily the first time in history, after 30 years of climate negotiations, that we had a robust conversation about phasing out fossil fuels. And that's just, it's kind of crazy, right? The climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. And the majority of emissions trapped in our atmosphere and causing the floods and the fires and the heat waves, they come from three things: oil, gas, and coal. And for 30 years, we have not had a conversation about fossil fuels. And I think that's because of the power of the fossil fuel industry.
And what I learned is that fossil fuels wasn't even mentioned in any of the, results from COPs in the past until this time. Is that possible?
I mean, yeah, in the Paris Agreement, I remember the day when I searched the Paris Agreement for the words oil, gas, coal, fossil fuels. They don't exist, and not in any of the COP decisions. We started having a debate about fossil fuels really at Glasgow. So 2 COPs ago, we actually launched a campaign, our first campaign of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And we had billboards and social media ads that said, "It's time to say the F words at COP." And it's actually pretty amazing 24 months later that we are having a global conversation about phasing out fossil fuels. We forced this conversation into public debate, of course, on the backs of giants, frontline community activists and indigenous leaders who for decades have been opposing fossil fuel projects, from pipelines to oil drilling, but in their homes, project by project. And I think what's different is that I think until the Fossil Fuel Treaty, we didn't have a pathway for that kind of keep it in the ground science and movement to land in policy. So there was always this disconnect where you would go to climate negotiations and talk about emissions reductions and talk about net zero and talk about targets, but never talk about constraining fossil fuels and the production of fossil fuels.
This is
And that's the conversation we started to have here at COP in Dubai in the last 2 weeks. And we made some gains. The text that came out is still too weak on issues of equity and justice and financing. Even on fossil fuels overall, it talks about transitioning our energy systems off fossil fuels, which was a way of many countries getting around actually having to say, we're going to phase out fossil fuels. It's funny, they're willing to talk about dramatically tripling renewable energy, but not reducing fossil fuels. And what that actually means is that we're putting energy into creating renewable energy systems, but they're also growing fossil fuel production.
right.
And I said online and in a lot of interviews over the last couple of weeks, the atmosphere doesn't care whether you're building renewable energy. The atmosphere cares whether you're displacing renewables,
Right.
displacing fossil fuels with your renewables.
Right.
So we need to build more of the good, but we need to stop expanding the bad and start winding it down.
Mhm.
And right now, the production gap report, which was put out 2 weeks ago by the United Nations Environment Program, says that we are on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal between now and 2030 than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 1.5. So we're literally putting almost $1 trillion into new fossil fuel development when all of the science says that we need to stop expanding it and wind it down. And so that's really become the core of the debate for climate policy and international agreements. And I think that is historic. We're finally having the right conversation. We don't have the right rules in place yet, but we're having the right conversation.
I understand. Someone said this is the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era. And you said, I believe, if I'm quoting you right, this COP opened the door to ending this era, but we're not walking through it, we're marching through it.
That's right. And behind the South Pacific Island nations, one of the things we started doing when we first started developing the Fossil Fuel Treaty was first going to reach out and talk to governments in the Pacific Islands about it. And the reason we did that is for two reasons, really. These are the most vulnerable nations on Earth, literally, because they're low-lying countries, because they are on the cyclone path, and cyclones have dramatically escalated over the last several years. They're the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And their mantra is 1.5 to stay alive, because literally the modeling shows if we go far above 1.5, those island nations are underwater. And they're already starting to look at relocation plans. But also because maybe because of that vulnerability, the South Pacific nations have been at the forefront of climate leadership internationally for several years. Like, we wouldn't have the 1.5 scientific goal agreed to at Paris. We wouldn't have the International Court of Justice decision to address climate change. Even the Fund for Loss and Damage, it really has been South Pacific Island nations at the forefront. Mm-hmm. So we now have 6 island nations who have endorsed the call of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And at COP, we had 4 other countries join them. So at Climate Week, we had Timor-Leste and Antigua and Barbuda join the South Pacific nations. At COP, we had 4 other countries join. So we now have 12 nation states who are calling for a fossil fuel treaty and starting to create the negotiating framework for a treaty. And that includes Colombia, which is a massive fossil fuel producing nation. And so that's a real tipping point for this work in calling for a companion agreement to the Paris Agreement. It won't replace Paris. Mm-hmm. It will help us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement by creating a plan of how you wind down fossil fuels and how countries have to collaborate to create new rules in order to help constrain fossil fuel production.
And was it the leader of Colombia? I believe his name was Petro, ironically, not Petrol, but Petro. Was
Petro,
he really
President Petro?
Yeah, the driving force behind this, because that's a big coup. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, he gave the keynote speech at the Fossil Fuel Treaty event at COP28, a high-level panel with representatives, prime ministers and presidents and ministers from 8 countries. I gave a speech there. It was the most nerve-wracking speech of my life,
Really?
and then was
You
followed by
nervous?
President Petro.
You nervous? Really?
Well, we knew that there were at least 40 ministers from 40 countries in the audience, every major outlet, and President Petro just sitting right there, one of my heroes, and many other countries like ministers from Vanuatu. And so it was a little nerve-wracking. President Petro's speech was unbelievable. I urge people to go and take a look. It's on our YouTube channel, Fossil Fuel Treaty YouTube channel, President Petro's speech. He didn't look at a single note.
Mm.
And he developed this frame as he was speaking that was so inspiring. He said, look, we're a coal producing nation, oil producing nation. We're the 5th largest coal producer in the world. The GDP of Colombia is 65% dependent on fossil fuel exports. And he said, and that's why we're calling for a fossil fuel treaty, because every day we know we make the problem worse, but we can't stop alone. And he said, and we have a choice right now as a human civilization. We can choose life or death. And we can choose to design our policies and our agreements on creating an economy that supports life and living systems or not. And the idea of a president of a country talking about, making a choice between life or an economy that prioritizes death. Like, it was just, anyways, I'm not doing it justice. It's been a long COP, and I only got home from Dubai last night, but I urge people to watch President Petro's speech. It felt like a historic moment to me.
Now we just need more Petros, a bunch of them.
That's right.
So the feeling was that once again, it was in the 11th hour. I remember one of the COPs when Obama was president, he came in the last minute, and John Kerry, back of the room negotiation.
Copenhagen.
Yeah, exactly. And Copenhagen. And I went to bed, what is today, Wednesday, Monday night, depressed about COP, and woke up 6 hours later, and there was some good news. I jumped out of bed. I turned on CNN and the Today Show and MSNBC, running back and forth, between my bedroom and living room, trying to see what they were going to say about it. And guess what? There wasn't coverage on the networks until about 11 a.m. I'm in Central Time. So this is part of the problem. We won't necessarily talk about that, but then the more I read, especially all the places where I do get my information on climate, it was, well, not so fast. This really is not a victory. It's like someone said, it's better than what we feared, but not nearly enough. What was going on with, Tzeporah at the last minute? I mean, did he really cave to all the criticism he was getting? Did he plan this all along, do you think? And that's why he kind of said, wink, wink, don't worry, I'm going to be there for you. And then in the last moments, he was. Any background on that?
What I witnessed at those final hours at COP was a distortion of the system and an abuse of power. I think the texts that were coming out in the final hours were much better than what we got. And what we got throws a lot of bones to the fossil fuel industry. There's a new section in there about how transition fuels will play an important role. This is a market signal to continue the expansion of gas. Mm-hmm. That is not what the science says. If you look at the IPCC report, the International Energy Agency report, they all say we have to stop expanding and wind down. There's all these commitments from countries to reduce methane, but what the President Al-Jaber was pushing along with the oil industry and OPEC was, we can do that through technology. We don't want production decline. Well, gas is methane. And if we have to dramatically reduce emissions and methane emissions, and we have replacements now with renewables, why are we allowing the production to increase? So in the early drafts, there was no recognition of transition fuels. There was recognition of the need for production and emissions decline. That's all been taken out of the draft that was then agreed to, and there was other language in there on net zero now, which again is a term that they can use modeling of overestimations of carbon capture and storage and protection through nature and then say, and offsets, and then say they're meeting targets, even though they're allowing production to increase.
Mhm.
This is the reason. These loopholes are the reason that we have had 28 COPs and emissions keep going up instead of down. It's bad modeling, it's bad math, it's overestimation of the technologies that we can use instead of actually declining production of fossil fuels. And what was, I think, really honestly disgusting and scandalous is that even though the majority of countries spoke about wanting a full phase out of fossil fuels in the text, and the texts that were being looked at prior to the final text had a lot of good language in them, all of a sudden at the final hour, I think it was 10 o'clock in the morning, this new text comes out, no one had seen before, and he takes it into the plenary and gavels it through. Do you know the island nations, the AOSIS countries, weren't even in the room?
I heard they
when
were
he hit the gavel.
crying in another place.
And they were on their way, and
Yeah.
they hadn't been consulted on the text. They didn't agree with the text. A lot of the least developed countries hadn't been consulted and didn't agree with the text. And he gavels it down, and a bunch of people around him, including Saudi Arabia, including China, including a number of oil lobbyists, all stand up and applaud him. And the pictures are consensus at the UAE COP.
Mm.
It
And
wasn't a consensus, and he gavelled it through without many of the countries. So it was a distorted process. He wanted some headlines around the world saying that it was a win. And at that point, those countries, and I talked to them and I saw their discussions, they could either make a fuss and walk out and break the whole system apart, or they could just accept it and try and work with it. And I think they decided to accept it. I mean, they spoke against it, but they didn't walk out of the process because the planet's on fire.
Yeah.
And they want cooperation. But I think it was an abuse of power by the president.
I think the one thing that did come out of this loud and clear, this COP, is that this is not working. The system of, first of all, having COPs in oil countries, oil-rich countries, even Al Gore, who's traditionally kind of timid or not as full-throated, bold as he could be. He's getting a lot bolder as he gets older.
I've never heard Al referred to as timid before, but okay.
When I say timid, maybe I've been around him too much. I went through his training, and the last few years he's been more, but he seemed to be politic that way. He didn't want to ruffle too many feathers. So in certain circles he was bold, but publicly I always felt he could come up with a few more lines. And
the gloves are off now for Al, that's for sure, especially on the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel lobbyists. But look, I actually think in some ways having that meeting in the UAE, in the belly of the beast, and even next year's in Azerbaijan, I don't necessarily think that's bad in that we're pushing and forcing the fossil fuel conversation, which I think is important. But we have to have, look, let's be honest. This process has failed from day one. The first COP, Saudi Arabia intervened and made sure that it was going to be a consensus-based process and not a rules voting process. And so that's what you have now. You have 190 countries trying to reach consensus with the major fossil fuel suppliers who all stand to benefit from continued fossil fuel production. They're making billions.
So that's
why in designing the treaty, we're designing it as a club of first mover countries who are designing rules to the highest possible level of ambition. Mm-hmm. And those rules will be binding. That means that not every country will join, but when you look at other treaties throughout history that were designed with high levels of ambition, like the prohibition of nuclear weapons, for example, countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Canada, they never signed it, but they stopped stockpiling nuclear weapons because that treaty created rules that became the social norm. Mm-hmm. They created a high bar for the world to meet. And they didn't allow these types of loopholes and dishonesty in the conversation. So that's why I have hope coming out of COP28 that there's going to be even more support for a fossil fuel treaty, and that fossil fuel treaty is going to set rules which are going to shake things up.
Did you, in fact, found the treaty, and when and what triggered it? Besides a lot of frustration from all the things you've been talking about.
I started the treaty initiative 3 years ago now. Well, 4 years if you count a year of research and development, but we went live 3 years ago. And I started it in part because of my own lived experience in in Canada and the tar sands, or what's called the oil sands. Because for years I thought Canada wasn't developing climate policy or positions internationally to really reduce emissions because we had governments that didn't believe in climate change. Then the Trudeau government got elected, and this is a government that believes in climate change, is acting on climate change, came to Paris with his hand on his heart and said Canada's back, and then put in place a lot of really good policies, a national carbon tax, a zero emission vehicle rules, to reduce emissions. But continued to approve new fracking, oil sands, and Canada's emissions just continued to go up. And it was that moment for me when I realized that governments don't believe right now that their responsibility is to constrain fossil fuel production, only supply and demand. And I started reaching out to other academics and activists from around the world, Norway, Malaysia, Ecuador, the UK, Australia, and I realized everyone was in the same position, that for 30 years we've been designing policy and international negotiations to make renewables cheaper, to reduce the demand and emissions of fossil fuels. But almost behind our backs, the fossil fuel industry has just been increasing production, new projects of oil, gas, and coal. And what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. And it's a huge missing piece. So then I started researching, how do you constrain the supply? Like, what kind of agreements do you need? And we need agreements between countries on who gets to produce and how much over time. And those agreements need to be based on equity. And we need new financial agreements, debt relief, so that, Ecuador's drilling for oil right now in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. And so if those countries are actually going to, like Colombia, Ecuador, are going to stop overproducing, they're going to need debt relief. They're going to need new trade agreements, tax agreements, support from wealthy countries to keep carbon in the ground. But if we're all going to survive, we have to keep carbon in the ground. We can't allow these economic pressures to continue to overproduce. And that's why we started the Fossil Fuel Treaty.
So what did you think of the loss and damage announcement, which came really right at the start of COP?
I mean, it's fantastic. We needed a loss and damage. It's far overdue to actually have an agreement on the framework and the fund. But then so far, the commitments by wealthy countries of how much money they're putting in there are laughable. I mean, really, the U.S. offered $30 million. The U.S. spends more than that every day on pet food, for crying out loud. This is the future of the planet we're talking about. And wealthy countries are responsible for ensuring support for loss and damage, because these developed countries didn't create this problem. The emissions trapped in our atmosphere today come from wealthy countries, and wealthy countries have benefited from the production of fossil fuels far more than developed countries.
So is that starting to sink in? Do you think that this COP really was a game changer in terms of realizing we can't just keep making excuses and putting it off and kicking the carbon can down the road, and specifically in terms of loss and damage recompense?
I don't know. I mean, now that the fund is created, I think there's going to be more pressure. That's true. I think the main problem right now is a lot of people are pressuring developing countries to produce more fossil fuels as a way for them to get economically stronger. We can't afford these emerging economies to go down the path that we have gone down, and we don't need to. Renewables are cheaper. They're available at scale. Mm-hmm. But the financing is not yet there for them. And that's because the big banks are doubling down on fossil fuel development. If you just look at 50% of the major banks, Carbon Disclosure Project is showing that 50% of the major banks, so a little over about 400 to 500 banks, have about 9 trillion in new fossil fuel expansion planned. So we need a reform of the financial architecture that supports countries in building a clean economy. We also need leadership from the major financial institutions to stop funding the fossil fuel economy and start winding it down in line with the science.
Just a note on banks. I was for too long, since college days, with Wells Fargo, and I kept saying, I've got to get out of Wells Fargo. They were, one of the top investors in fossil fuels. And we finally did it a couple of years ago. We moved to First Republic because they seem to have a better track record on climate and some green policies. And I made it clear, I don't want $1 of my meager savings going into anything to do with carbon. Finally relaxed, caught my, was like, whew, glad I did that. Should have done it years ago. And all of a sudden they're merging with JP Morgan, one of the worst offenders. It's like, you can't win.
Yeah. I mean, it really is important to figure out where your money is and to try and find banks and institutions, credit unions, et cetera, that are going to do, put in place the right policies. But also, if you do have money at major banks, then you should be advocating with those banks to put their money where their mouth is. And and that means winding down fossil fuel assets and investment, and putting more money into renewables, et cetera. I mean, our lives depend upon it. So the problem is everybody knows that. The science is really clear. And every ton of carbon we allow to go in the atmosphere today is going to take lives. We know that. 5 million people died on the planet last year just from lethal heat alone. But everyone wants to be the last barrel sold. And it's greed. The fossil fuel industry is the most profitable industry on the planet. They've been making $2.8 billion a day, every day for the last 50 years, according to World Bank data. And now, even though all those banks and all those countries and companies know that we need to start not just stop expansion of fossil fuels and wind it down, but we're going to have to start decommissioning fossil fuel assets. They know that, and they see the writing on the wall, and they all want to be the last ones to actually move.
It's sort of like
and that's reprehensible.
Before the music stops, they're scrambling around, going faster and faster, see if we can get our bit before the music stops.
That's what it feels like.
Yeah, crazy. I don't know if you have children.
I do. I have 2 boys.
And what ages?
20 and 24.
Well, my 29-year-old daughter, my only, just had a daughter last month. And
congratulations.
Thank you. I've been at this green media for 25 years, believe it or not. And I think I've been following you almost that long, I think at least 2 decades. And I've, as we all talk about future generations, well, all of a sudden this baby is in flesh and blood in my arms, future generations. And did you see that song that the British young woman did? We Tried. That was going around.
So beautiful. So beautiful.
I watched that yesterday morning and I just burst into tears because I was also looking at a picture of Ezzy, my new granddaughter, and thinking about what is she going to see in her life? And of course, all children born and yet to be born. So it is so urgent. It is so maddening. It is an interesting time to be alive. I try to put a positive spin on it, so much.
It is, what a lot of people don't realize is that we are living the moment where industrial society is re-envisioning itself, how we work, how we get to work, how we heat our homes, how we travel. And we now have the technology to entirely change the way we live. And when I get upset and I think about, I had this amazing conversation with my grandmother right before she passed away. And she said, you have to remember how much the world has changed in my lifetime. Like when your mom was growing up, I didn't know a single person who'd ever been on a plane. We didn't have a computer or that. She said that Raspberry you're always holding, because that was back when I had a BlackBerry. And she said we didn't have any of that. No. We had a phone, but it was a party line. When it rang twice, it was for us. And when you got bored, sometimes you picked it up and listened to other people. Like they didn't have a TV, they had a radio. So the world has entirely changed in my grandmother's lifetime. And it is changing in ours as well. We are capable of such quick change. Yeah. When I first started campaigning 30 years ago, we didn't have internet. I campaigned by fax and telephone.
I knew you've been at this as long as I have, even longer.
So we have the ability to totally change the world, and that is happening in our lifetimes, and that is really exciting. But it will only happen fast enough to save lives if we all engage with it. We all have to do our part. You don't have to be an expert. You're still a voter. Our governments work for us. And so many people ask me about what they should buy and what they should wear and how they should eat.
What should I do?
Yeah. Lifestyle is important, but the most important thing you can do is let your elected decision maker know that you care and you're watching them, and that you want them to ramp down fossil fuels and increase renewable energy, and that you're going to vote according to your values. That's because we need systems change. We don't just need to change our light bulbs.
Yeah, and I left mainstream media. My first half of my career was with CBS Radio because I couldn't get environmental news on, and have been trying to make it an independent media. And that's one area that is really overlooked. So the millions go into climate tech, but what about educating the public? What about bringing the population along? So that's sort of my area of focus, trying to make people realize, especially the funders and philanthropists, that if we don't have an eco-literate, climate-savvy public, there's no way we're going to win. We've got, 6+ years to cut our emissions in half, and we're going in the wrong direction. And I don't know about you, but when I hear net zero by 2050, it's like, if we're around, 2050 seems so far away, given how quickly things are changing. But maybe they can change just as quickly in the positive direction. Maybe they have to.
Well, I mean, the thing what a lot of people don't realize is that social change isn't linear. It happens at tipping point moments, and I think we are living one of those tipping point moments where the price of renewables is plummeting. We're finally having a fossil fuel conversation when new technologies are coming on board or strengthening existing technologies like battery storage and electric vehicles that make it easier to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. That tipping point is now.
Yeah. It is, and we really need to see it in mainstream media too. Again, my frustration hour after hour, it was all about Hunter Biden and a little bit about, Israel, Hamas, and then a bunch of kind of what I would call fluffy stories. Like, this is the future of humanity on the planet. Why does it take till 11 a.m. Central Time to see the first story, as much as I could monitor it? But I have friends out there who monitored other networks, and it really took that long, hours after the agreement came out. Not to harp on that too much, because that is my obsession. But before we move on from young people, I loved what I read. I think it was on your Facebook page about the youth. You said, don't just admire the young people for their activism and applaud their efforts. Don't let our children carry the burden alone, the mess we created. I may be paraphrasing, but that is my other obsession. When people say, Betsy, just let the young people take over. They get it. They're going to do it. They're angry. They're loaded for bear. I say, wait a minute. What are the young people like Greta and Gang saying? They're screaming at us, the adults in the room, supposedly, do something, do everything you can so we can stay in school and we can have a hope of a future. And so many of my fellow baby boomers have said, like, pat me on the back, like, why am I wasting my time when they're going to solve it? Like, no, excuse me. They can go play tennis, guilt-free. And it's really quite common, quite shocking to me how that's.
Oh, it is to me too. And that's why I talk about it all the time. I mean, I hear all the time from my friends, it's so great that all those youth were marching. Well, where were you? Those youth should be dating. They should be playing instruments. They should be playing sports.
Exactly.
We should be marching.
They think
I love that. I love Bill McKibben's new group, Third Act, for that. It's seniors engaging in climate activism. I love that.
I guess now that I'm a grandmother, I'm probably a senior, even though I don't feel like it still, even though it's a long, slow slog. So we just have a couple minutes left. Well, what would you like to share that perhaps we haven't touched on yet about this COP, or just the bigger picture where we are? You said tipping point. I completely agree. Yeah. Better be, or we're going to tip over. The whole planet's going to just fall over on its axis. Sometimes feels that way.
Well, I guess I would like to share that, a lot of people say to me, this fossil fuel treaty, it's such a big idea. It's so exciting. How can I support you? And I guess what I want to say about that is make it your own. No one owns the idea of a global fossil fuel treaty in the same way no one owned the idea of a Paris Agreement. We have a small international secretariat that is trying to provide materials to people all over the world, draft motions to get your city council to endorse, a science letter or a faith letter for sign-on, a lobby packet, and government briefing reports so you can meet with your federal government and get them to join the growing bloc of countries. There's so many ways that people could engage in the campaign, and it's happening. I met people at COP who are from Mexico who have designed their own fossil fuel treaty Mexico campaign and even website. I've met people from South Korea, from Turkey, from all over the world now. I think the campaign's active in 40 countries. So fossilfueltreaty.org, join us. Don't wait for someone else to do the organizing that you think needs to happen. And whether it's with Fossil Fuel Treaty or we run campaigns at Stand.earth on shipping, on fashion, on LNG, or another organization that speaks to you. This is the time to act. And you don't have to be doing it full time like me. You can be doing it, dedicate a couple hours a week on the weekend to actually doing this work. But take the time, not just to click here and sign a petition, but to think about how you can use your contacts and your energy to organize. Because that's what we need. We need more people thinking about how to organize to make this movement bigger and stronger.
Thank you. Before we let you go, and before I had this wonderful opportunity, thank you so much to speak with you. I wanted to interview you about Stand.earth. I heard you speak in New York during Climate Week. I was in the back of the room, had to run off to 5 other events, but they're doing amazing work holding corporate entities, businesses responsible. Just say a couple of words about them, and then we'll someday hopefully sooner rather than later, do a longer interview on their great work.
Great. So Stand.earth is an organization that was founded on the west coast of Canada and the US, North America. And we do an interesting thing. We analyze supply chains and data in order to figure out whether or not major corporations and governments are keeping up with their policies and what the bar should be set for different sectors. So every year, Stan puts out an amazing report card on the top 50 fashion brands. So check it out at stand.earth. You can see who's better, H&M or Patagonia. You can find out what Lululemon is using to make their clothes. Spoiler alert, fracked gas, in fact, and built in factories that are predominantly still coal. These companies have enormous power to actually change not only what they're using to produce their products, but what kind of energy. And they're so big, some of these companies, that if they demand renewable energy, they can make the difference of whether or not a new coal plant is built in Vietnam. So Stan does supply chain research. We also run big campaigns to protect old growth forests, or what's left of it, in Canada and the United States, and to stop the expansion of new fossil fuel pipelines and new oil drilling and fracking. And there's lots of ways for people to get involved in Stan's campaigns.
One of the earlier campaigns I remember you being associated with, I think you led it, was the Victoria's Secret, not so their dirty secret. Mention that, because
at the time, Victoria's Secret was producing 1 million catalogs a day, predominantly made from Canada's old growth forests. And our campaign against Victoria's Got a Dirty Secret campaign actually changed the way that catalog paper was made in North America. So you can have a big influence if you come together.
I'm from Marin County, and Restoration Hardware, I don't know if that's national or not, but they put out a catalog that must have been 1,000 pages, and mostly black and white, because for some reason they're into like beige and gray white furniture. But I would cringe, and this is in supposedly progressive Northern California, the Bay Area. They got enough flack finally that they either put out smaller ones or put them out less often, or maybe put it on recycled paper. Whoop to do. But that kind of consciousness, and junk mail is still a big problem. Getting stuff you don't even and thinking about the trees that we need to suck up the carbon, being chopped down for toilet paper or junk mail. A lot of work to do. So
it's just crazy.
I
know.
We need this
but
conservation consciousness to pervade the mainstream, right?
That's right.
Yeah, well, that's what Green TV is for. A little plug there, to fill that green gap in mainstream media's coverage. Which they've got. It's almost like when you talked about at COP, they didn't say fossil fuels all these years, which is shocking. It's almost like it took until a couple of years ago for the network newscasters to say climate change, and they got over their aversion, their fear of saying those words. They still won't say climate emergency. Certainly not that I've heard. But like they think they're covering it now, and it's the tip of the melting iceberg. Go look at. Go to our website. We cover every angle up and down and back and forth. And we're not CNN. We're a small team of volunteers.
On that note, I want to leave you with one example, because sometimes people can get overwhelmed and depressed about this work.
You think?
But one of the campaigns we run at Stand is on the Amazon. And when we first started working on the Amazon, we found out that there were companies, banks, who had made all these statements saying, we're going to protect Indigenous rights, we're going to protect climate, we would never work in the Amazon. And so our data researchers at Stand Research Group started looking at, well, who's funding the oil trade in the Amazon? We found 6 European banks who have all made policies saying they aren't, who actually were. And many of them, when we showed them that information and put out a report, didn't realize they were. All 6 changed their policies, and now BNP Paribas has actually committed to making the Amazon a no-go area for extractive oil development. And when BNP Paribas did that, our estimation is that they moved $6 to $7 billion of oil finance out of the Amazon because of our research. So that's a huge impact, and we can have that kind of impact if we focus and if we get creative in how we do this work.
Tzeporah, thank you so much for being such a major solutionary. This series is Meet the Solutionaries. I want to do a show next called Womanifesting Change, all the green female champions, heroes out there, and I'd love to have you back for that.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care.
Okay, continue on. Go loud, go often, go big. That does it for this edition of GreenTV.com's Meet the Solutionaries series. I want to invite you back. We're going to be having some other folks who are also in Dubai, try to get those edited, posted, turned around as quickly as possible for you. Want to thank my tech producer, Jay McDonough, and our team of very, very dedicated volunteers, a small but very mighty team of volunteers at GreenTV.com. I'll give their names in the future, but right now I think we're probably used up enough time. So just want to say thanks again. And this is one of our, but not the last, debriefs from COP28 in Dubai. Thanks for being with us.